And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. We all believe in an inner truth, a self that is uniquely ours, waiting to be expressed. But what if that self is nothing more than a story we tell ourselves? Authenticity is one of the great obsessions of our time. We seek it in leaders, admire it in artists, and strive for it in our own lives. But is it something real, solid we can grasp? Or is it an illusion, a construct shaped by forces we barely notice? These questions are not new. They have haunted philosophers for centuries, shaping debates about morality, identity, and freedom. Some have argued that authenticity is about living according to reason, while others insist it is about emotional sincerity. Some claim it is about autonomy, others about overcoming social conditioning. And then there are those who question whether it exists at all. So what does it really mean to be authentic? And in an age of digital identities and curated selves, is it even possible anymore? This is the story of an idea that has shaped how we think about ourselves, and that might just tell us more than we expect about the world we live in today. What if everything you believe about yourself is an illusion? What if the choices you make, the personality you present, the values you hold dear are not expressions of an inner truth, but performances shaped by forces beyond your control? We like to think of authenticity as something real, something solid, something we can hold on to. But the more we search for it, the more elusive it becomes. To thine own self be true, Polonius says in Hamlet, as if the task were simple. But philosophers have spent centuries wrestling with the idea, and the deeper they go, the more complex it becomes. Is authenticity about discovering something innate, something waiting to be uncovered? Or is it about creating ourselves through action, forging meaning from the choices we make? Does it require separating ourselves from the influence of others, or does it demand we recognize and navigate the social forces that shape us? And if we can, in fact, be true to ourselves, how do we distinguish authenticity from self-delusion? These are not just abstract questions. The search for authenticity is woven into our daily lives. We admire those who seem to possess it, yet we struggle to define it in ourselves. Aristotle believed that authenticity was about living a life of virtue, aligning one's actions with rational moral principles. A person was most truly themselves, he argued, when they acted in accordance with reason, cultivating habits that refined their character. Authenticity, in this sense, was not about being different from others or expressing some hidden essence. It was about living in a way that reflected excellence. To be authentic was to fulfill one's purpose as a rational moral being. But modern life complicates this search in ways Aristotle could never have imagined. Today, identity is not just personal, it is digital, performative, and endlessly adaptable. Social media rewards self-presentation, turning authenticity into a commodity. We construct versions of ourselves for public display, always aware of the audience watching. Are we still capable of believing in a stable, essential self? Or is authenticity itself a construct, a fleeting illusion in an era where selfhood is constantly being rewritten? To answer this, we must look deeper into the evolution of authenticity, into the lives of the philosophers who shaped it, and into the existential dilemmas that continue to haunt us. Imagine standing at a crossroads. One path leads to a life shaped by careful reason, where every choice aligns with an objective moral order. The other leads inward into the depths of the self, where truth is not found in logic but in struggle. This is the divide between Aristotle and Augustine, two of history's most profound thinkers, each offering a radically different answer to the question of authenticity. Is being true to oneself a matter of rational virtue, or is it a battle against the self's own desires and deceptions? For Aristotle, authenticity was not about self-expression or emotional depth. It was about virtue. A person was most truly themselves when they lived in accordance with reason, cultivating habits that refined their character and aligned them with the highest good. The authentic individual was not the one who followed their impulses, but the one who mastered them, shaping themselves into an ideal that was both personal and universal. Aristotle did not believe in an isolated self, Authenticity was tested and revealed through action within the structure of a community. Be authentic was to be excellent, to fulfill one's purpose as a rational moral being. But what if rational action is not enough? Augustine introduced an entirely different vision of authenticity, one that turned inward into the complexities of human will. Where Aristotle saw self-mastery as a process of refinement, Augustine saw it as a battlefield. The human soul, he argued, is divided. We do not simply choose the good rationally. We are torn between higher and lower desires, between the pull of virtue and the pull of sin. To be authentic, in Augustine's view, was not merely to act rightly, but to confront this struggle honestly, to recognize the parts of ourselves that deceive, that seek approval, that mask selfishness as righteousness. True authenticity required a radical form of self-examination, an unflinching awareness of our own contradictions. Lies a profound tension. Aristotle's vision of authenticity is one of self-perfection, of aligning with an external standard of virtue. Augustine's is one of self-exposure, of recognizing the depths of our own moral failures. The first seeks clarity, the second embraces uncertainty. The first demands discipline, the second, humility. Both, in their own way, insist that authenticity is not given, it must be earned. Yet, in the modern world, both perspectives face new challenges. Aristotle's emphasis on communal virtue feels distant in an era of individualism, while Augustine's introspective struggle seems almost impossible in a world of distractions. So where does that leave us? If authenticity is not simply about action or introspection, perhaps it is something more fragile, something that must be constantly negotiated between who we are, who we wish to be, and who the world expects us to become. We often imagine authenticity as a return to something pure, unspoiled, and original. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that modern life had corrupted us, that civilization had buried our true selves beneath layers of conformity, expectation, and artificiality. If we could strip away these distortions, he argued, we would rediscover our natural goodness, our authentic being. But what if Rousseau was wrong? What if there is no original self to return to at all? Søren Kierkegaard posed a far more unsettling idea, that the self is not something we find, but something we must create, alone, without certainty, and often in fear. For Rousseau, authenticity is about recovery. He believed that human beings, in their natural state, were free, compassionate, and self-sufficient. But as societies grew more complex, we became entangled in systems of status and approval. We began to see ourselves through the eyes of others, shaping our identities not from within, but in response to external validation. This was, for Rousseau, a fall from grace. The authentic life was the one that rejected this artificiality, that reclaimed the unfiltered emotions and instincts that civilization had suppressed. But can we ever truly step outside of society's influence? Kierkegaard argued that Rousseau's vision was an illusion, that there was no pure, untouched self waiting to be uncovered. Instead, the self is something we must construct, but the act of constructing it is terrifying. He called this angst, an existential anxiety that comes from realizing that we alone are responsible for defining ourselves. There is no inherent identity to return to, no blueprint to follow. The inauthentic life, Kierkegaard warned, is the one that flees from this responsibility, submerging itself in the crowd, adopting its values without question, seeking comfort in roles assigned by society. The authentic life, by contrast, requires standing alone, embracing the uncertainty of existence, making choices that are truly one's own. But is such radical self-creation possible? Rousseau saw authenticity as stripping away the false layers of society, while Kierkegaard saw it as a confrontation with freedom itself. Rousseau longed for a return to innocence. Kierkegaard insisted there was no innocence to return to. And yet, both thinkers understood something crucial, that authenticity is fragile, that it is constantly at risk of being lost. In the modern world, this dilemma has only deepened. We construct versions of ourselves for public display, on social media, in the workplace, in relationships, always aware of how we are perceived. Rousseau would say we must strip these performances away to find our real selves. But Kierkegaard would ask, what if there is nothing beneath those layers? What if authenticity is not about finding a self, but about having the courage to create one? Immanuel Kant believed that authenticity was not about self-discovery, but about self-governance. To be truly free, he argued, was not to follow one's instincts or desires, but to live according to principles dictated by reason. The authentic person is not the one who indulges every impulse, but the one who acts according to a universal moral law, one they impose upon themselves. For Kant, true autonomy was not about doing whatever one wants. It was about choosing to be bound by rational duty. Authenticity, in this sense, was an ethical project. To be true to oneself was to align one's will with reason, to live in a way that could be universally justified. What if this idea of moral law is itself a form of self-deception? Friedrich Nietzsche rejected Kant's vision completely. He saw it not as a path to freedom, but as a refined form of submission, a way of dressing up obedience as autonomy. The idea of a universal moral law, Nietzsche argued, was not an expression of true authenticity, but a constraint on it, an invention designed to suppress individuality and enforce conformity. Instead, Nietzsche insisted that authenticity was not about obeying a moral code, but about creating one. The authentic person, in his view, does not follow pre-existing values. They forge their own, shaping themselves according to their instincts, will, and creative power. This was the essence of the Übermensch, the individual who rises above conventional morality and takes full responsibility for their self-definition. This clash between Kant and Nietzsche presents us with a troubling dilemma. If authenticity is about universal moral duty, as Kant believed, does that mean we are never truly free? If it is about radical self-creation, as Nietzsche argued, does that mean there are no limits to what an individual can justify? Kant offers stability, but at the cost of individuality. Nietzsche offers liberation, but at the risk of chaos. In modern life, we see both impulses at play. We are told to be ourselves, yet we also feel pressure to conform to ethical and social norms. We long for a sense of personal freedom, yet we fear what might happen if everyone abandoned shared values. Authenticity is not about choosing between these two extremes, but about navigating the tension between them, between structure and rebellion, between the need for meaning and the need for self-definition. The real question is whether we can live without both. If we reject Kant's moral structure entirely, do we risk nihilism? If we reject Nietzsche's vision of self-overcoming, do we settle for a life dictated by duty rather than true individuality? The search for authenticity is not just a philosophical puzzle. It is a balancing act, one that each of us must confront in the way we choose to live. Most of us go through life assuming we have more time. We tell ourselves that we will become our true selves eventually, when the moment is right, the distractions subside, when the demands of the present ease. But what if this assumption is itself a form of self-deception? Martin Heidegger believed that inauthenticity was not just an occasional failure, but the default state of human existence. Do not simply avoid asking who we really are. We structure our lives around this avoidance. Heidegger described this condition as das Man, the they-self, in which individuals do not live as themselves, but as part of an anonymous collective. We inherit our beliefs, opinions, and desires from the world around us, rarely stopping to question whether they are truly our own. We say what people say, we do what people do. We live in ways that seem natural, even inevitable. And in doing so, we avoid the most difficult and unsettling question of all: what does it mean to truly exist? Heidegger, the only way to break free from this passive mode of being was to confront the reality of death. He argued that most people relate to death in an inauthentic way, acknowledging it in the abstract, but refusing to see it as something that directly concerns them. The inauthentic person says, yes, death comes, but not yet. Not to me, not today. But the authentic individual, Heidegger insisted, understands that life is finite, that every moment is lived against the backdrop of its inevitable end. He called this being toward death, the idea that authenticity begins when we stop postponing the question of who we are and start living with the full knowledge that we will not live forever. Jean-Paul Sartre took this further. While Heidegger believed authenticity required confronting mortality, Sartre argued that it required confronting radical freedom. He rejected the idea that we are born with any predetermined essence, insisting instead that we are nothing until we define ourselves through action. This, he said, is both our greatest power and our greatest burden. There is no script, no divine plan, no external force shaping who we are. We are condemned to be free, responsible for making ourselves without any guarantee of meaning or purpose. But this is precisely why Sartre saw inauthenticity, what he called bad faith, as so tempting. To live in bad faith is to pretend that we are not free, to tell ourselves that our roles, obligations, or circumstances define us. The waiter who acts as though he is only a waiter, the lover who behaves as though their fate is set. These are the people who refuse to recognize their own agency. Authenticity, for Sartre, demands that we abandon these illusions and take responsibility for our existence. The question is whether we are willing to accept that terrifying responsibility, or whether we will spend our lives avoiding it. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that authenticity was about radical freedom, but Simone de Beauvoir saw a flaw in his thinking. He insisted that individuals were fully responsible for defining themselves, that they alone shaped their identities through their choices. But de Beauvoir asked, what if the ability to choose is not evenly distributed? What if the freedom to define oneself is constrained, not by personal failure, but by structures of power that dictate whose choices matter and whose do not? De Beauvoir, authenticity could not be understood in isolation. Sartre saw bad faith as an individual failure, the refusal to accept one's own freedom. But de Beauvoir argued that bad faith was often imposed. A woman, she observed, does not enter the world with the same existential possibilities as a man. Birth, she is conditioned to be the other, not a subject defining herself freely, but an object defined in relation to men. Her value is measured by how she is perceived, by whether she conforms to social expectations. Can she be fully authentic when society has already dictated the terms of her existence? This is why de Beauvoir reframed authenticity as a political struggle. The problem was not simply that individuals deceived themselves about their freedom. It was that society systematically restricted the freedom of certain groups. Women were told that their purpose was to nurture, to serve, to be desirable but not desiring. The same could be said for other marginalized identities, for anyone whose ability to define themselves was constrained by race, class, or social status. If authenticity is about living in accordance with one's true self, then the question becomes, what happens when that self is shaped by oppression? This critique reshaped existentialism. Sartre's vision of the lone individual confronting freedom was powerful, but de Beauvoir understood that not all individuals stand at the same starting line. She argued that authenticity is not just a personal project, but a collective one. To be authentic is not simply to choose oneself, but to fight for a world in which all people have the ability to do the same. This idea remains as urgent as ever. In life, we are constantly told to be ourselves, yet the boundaries of identity are policed in ways that make true authenticity difficult. Who gets to define themselves freely, and who is forced to navigate a system that resists their autonomy? De Beauvoir's answer was clear. Authenticity is not just about self-awareness, it is about resistance. It is about dismantling the forces that limit freedom, about refusing to let society dictate who we are allowed to be. The question is not just whether we can be true to ourselves, but whether we can create a world where others are free to do the same. If authenticity is about being true to oneself, what happens when the very idea of the self collapses? Sigmund Freud was among the first to suggest that our identities are not as coherent as we like to believe. Beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts, he argued, lies a vast unconscious realm. Hidden drives, repressed memories, instincts we do not fully understand. The self, in Freud's view, is not a singular entity, but a battleground between competing psychological forces. The id, the source of raw desires, the superego, the internalized voice of societal expectation, and the ego, which struggles to mediate between them. If our thoughts and behaviors are shaped by unconscious forces we cannot control, can we ever truly be authentic? This challenge to the idea of a stable self was taken even further by postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Freud suggested that we are shaped by unconscious desires, but Foucault argued that we are shaped by power. The very idea of identity, he claimed, is not something we discover within ourselves. It is something we are given, imposed by the institutions, norms, and discourses that define what is normal, moral, or acceptable. Schools, governments, religious institutions, the medical system, all of these shape us, often without our awareness. Authenticity, Foucault suggested, may be nothing more than an internalized set of expectations, a belief that we are choosing freely when we are merely playing the roles assigned to us. Derrida took this even further, questioning whether there is any stable meaning at all. Language, he argued, does not simply express reality, it constructs it. Words do not have fixed definitions. Their meanings shift depending on context, on history, on how they're interpreted. And if language itself is unstable, what does that mean for identity? The idea that there is a fixed original self beneath the layers of social conditioning is, for Derrida, an illusion. There is no authentic core to be uncovered, only a series of shifting interpretations, a self that is always in the process of being rewritten. This is perhaps the most unsettling critique of authenticity. If the self is not something we can uncover, but something that is constructed through power, discourse, and language, is authenticity even possible? Or is it simply another illusion, footing story we tell ourselves? Perhaps the task is not to strip away external influences to find the real self, but to become aware of those influences, to recognize how they shape us, and to reclaim agency in how we navigate them. The question is no longer whether we can be authentic, but whether we can understand the extent to which authenticity itself is a construct. If authenticity is a construct, does that mean it is an illusion? Or does it mean that the search for authenticity is not about uncovering something fixed and essential, but about creating meaning in a world where the self is never settled? Perhaps authenticity is not a state we achieve, but a process we engage in. Negotiation between self-awareness and the external forces that shape us, between our deepest instincts and the narratives imposed upon us. This tension is not new. For Aristotle, authenticity meant living in accordance with reason, but reason itself is shaped by culture and education. For Augustine, it was about aligning the soul with divine truth, but even religious conviction is mediated by history, doctrine, and interpretation. Rousseau imagined a return to an uncorrupted natural self, but Kierkegaard shattered this illusion, showing that the self is never fully given. It must be chosen, and that choice is fraught with anxiety. Kant grounded authenticity in moral autonomy, yet Nietzsche saw this as self-deception, a refusal to embrace the terrifying freedom of self-creation. Heidegger and Sartre warned that we spend most of our lives evading this responsibility, clinging to roles that offer stability at the cost of genuine existence. De Beauvoir expanded the question further: can one be truly authentic in a world that systematically limits the freedom of others? Freud, Foucault, and Derrida dismantled the very idea of a stable self, arguing that what we call authenticity may be nothing more than a shifting construct, shaped by forces beyond our control. These debates are not just theoretical. They define our daily lives, shaping how we think about identity, morality, and belonging. Social media amplifies these tensions, offering both the illusion of authenticity and its most sophisticated performance. We curate ourselves in ways that feel real, yet always with an awareness of the audience watching. We celebrate authenticity in public figures, yet we remain suspicious of its construction. We are told to be ourselves, yet the self we present is always shaped by the expectations, algorithms, and pressures that surround us. Where does that leave us? If authenticity is not about discovering a pre-existing truth, but about the process of self-definition, then the challenge is not to strip away external influences to find an untouched core. That core does not exist. Instead, the task is to engage with the contradictions, to acknowledge the forces shaping us while taking responsibility for the way we navigate them. Perhaps authenticity is not about certainty, but about the courage to exist in uncertainty. It is not about finding a true self, but about forging one, again and again, in the face of a world that will always try to define us first. The question is not whether the self is real. It is whether, in the fleeting moments we call a life, we dare to make it real. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced, and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform